For the fourth time in modern Chinese history, the Dagu forts, scene of ferocious battles in the Second Opium War, were at the forefront of the conflict once again in 1900. A great fleet of foreign warships lay off Tientsin in the Bohai Sea. On the 16th of June 1900, a meeting of the naval commanders from the different powers decided that capturing the Dagu forts, the entrance to the Hai River, was vitally important and the key to maintaining a foreign foothold in northern China. The Allies faced the same problems as when they last attacked the forts in the Second Opium War. The sandbars and narrow 200-yard channel at the mouth of the river prevented large warships from directly assaulting the forts. Smaller and more vulnerable gunboats and torpedo boat destroyers would have to be used instead. These vessels, with their shorter range armaments, were easier targets for Chinese gunners, as the events of 1859 had demonstrated. In 1900, the Dagu forts were well equipped with modern artillery, manned by 2,000 Chinese troops. The Chinese also had 4 modern German-built torpedo boats tied up at Dagu, and if properly handled, these formidable vessels had the potential to seriously disrupt Allied naval operations. The Allies would deploy 10 smaller vessels and just 900 men to assault and storm the forts. Imperial Russian Navy Vice Admiral Hildebrandt sent a message to the fort's Chinese commander, informing him that the Allies would occupy the position, quote, by consent or by force, unquote, and demanding that he surrender by 2 a.m. on the 17th of June. The Chinese disregarded this missive, and instead they opened fire on the Allied gunboats at 12:45 a.m. The Russian gunboat Koritz was very badly damaged. Another Russian gunboat, Gilyak, ran aground, while the British vessels HMS Whiting and Lion and the Russian Iltis were all hit multiple times. Fortunately for all concerned, the Chinese did not send their brand new torpedo boats to sea, leaving them inexplicably tied up. The Whiting, under Lieutenant Colin Mackenzie, and HMS Fame, under Lieutenant Roger Keyes, each destroyer towing a whaler containing a 10-man boarding party, came alongside, and after a brief fight they seized them intact. Artillery exchanges continued until nearly dawn. It was decided to disembark the sailors and marines from the gunboats, preparatory to launching a ground assault against the northwest fort. Led by 200 Russians and Austrians, followed by 380 British and Italians, with 300 Japanese closely behind, a powder magazine was detonated in the fort shortly before the Allied forces arrived, a lucky shot from one of the gunboats killing or wounding many of the Chinese defenders. The Japanese were given the honor of storming the fort, which they did so with their customary suicidal bravery and lack of concern for casualties. British and Italian sailors and marines led the assault on the North Fort, and it was quickly captured. That left the 2 intact forts on the south bank of the Hai River. The Allies cleverly decided to use the guns that they had captured in the 2 northern forts. The 2 southern forts were subjected to a short but very intensive barrage, from which another magazine was blown up. Chinese troops were then observed running away, and the Allied forces crossed the river and took possession of both forts by 6:30 a.m. Total Allied casualties were 172 killed and wounded. Chinese casualties were unknown. The Allied assault on the Dagu forts erased any lingering doubts in Empress Dowager Cixi's mind that complete support for the Boxers was both necessary and desirable. On the 19th of June, in response to the attack on the Dagu forts, Cixi ordered that all foreigners should leave Peking within 24 hours. They were promised an escort from the Imperial Army to assure their safety through Boxer lines. The next day, the German minister, Baron von Ketteler, was murdered in the street by a Manchu captain, prompting the not unreasonable assumption by Sir Claude MacDonald and the other diplomats that to leave the Legation Quarter would be tantamount to a death sentence. The Empress Dowager declared war on the great powers on the 21st of June 1900. However, many of her regional governors actually refused to support the war and maintained a neutral stance, including Li Hongzhang in Canton, Yuan Shikai in Shandong, and Zhang Zedong in Wuhan. General Yuan actually suppressed the Boxers in his province. All of this meant that the war was limited to Peking and Tientsin and the country in between, rather than being a national war of liberation as envisioned by the imperial court. Tientsin was in extreme danger following the battle at the Dagu forts. Cixi ordered General Ni to cooperate with the Boxers and to destroy the foreign settlements. Approximately 13,000 imperial troops and Boxers set about this task with alacrity, bringing up modern artillery and opening a fearsome bombardment upon the thinly held defense lines. Ni's guns would mouth a total of over 60,000 shells into foreign Tientsin during the course of the siege, but fortunately for the defenders, poor quality controls and corruption at Chinese armaments factories meant that a high proportion of those shells were duds. An attempt was made to reinforce Tientsin's small garrison with fresh troops from the fleet. 440 Russians and 131 U.S. Marines, under the command of Captain Littleton Waller, traveled the 30 miles from the coast along the railway, but they were ambushed by at least 2,000 dug-in Chinese troops just 2 miles from the foreign settlements and forced to retire. The Americans lost 3 men killed and 13 wounded. A much more serious assault was mounted by the Chinese against Admiral Seymour's relief column on the 18th of June, when Generals Ma Fuxiang and Ma Fulu's mixed Gansu and Boxer forces attempted an encirclement. The Chinese force included 5,000 Muslim cavalry armed with modern rifles. The Allies managed to fight them off with great difficulty, as the trains were assaulted from multiple directions. Seymour lost 7 men killed and 57 wounded, while 200 Gansu braves fell alongside 100 Boxers. Seymour's force was now threatened by professional troops commanded by General Dong. His subordinates, General Ma Fuxiang and General Ma Fulu, commanded 2 separate forces that were each several thousand strong. Inconclusive clashes between Seymour's column, Boxers and Gansu troops left 5 Italian Marines dead, while the Chinese lost at least 102 killed. Wounded Boxers often feigned death, only to jump up and resume the attack when Seymour's troops came near to them. Seymour's advance could go no further. The Chinese had successfully stopped the Allies in their tracks. Seymour was encumbered with multiple wounded, his supplies were insufficient for a protracted battle through to Peking, and more large-scale Chinese attacks were expected. Seymour decided to retire to Tientsin, get more men and supplies, and try again to get through to the besieged Legation Quarter before it was too late. But soon, going back by rail also became impossible. For Admiral Seymour, getting back safely to Tientsin soon proved to be as difficult as advancing to Peking. Seymour managed to turn his trains around and started back. Everything went well until he arrived at the bridge over the high river at Yangtsun. The bridge had been severely damaged, burned by Boxers or imperial troops. The force was left with 2 choices. They could cross the river and march 18 miles to Tientsin down the railway line, or they could collect small boats and row 30 miles along the high river to safety. Unsurprisingly, the mostly naval force under Seymour's command chose to stick to the water. But traversing the high was to prove far from easy, for at every village along the river Boxers lay in wait. Fighting would be continuous, causing numerous casualties, including Seymour's chief of staff, Captain Jellicoe, who was shot in the head and nearly killed. Seymour's bedraggled and exhausted men managed to row 3 miles down the river on the first day, fighting all the way. The men were on quarter rations, and most had less than 10 rounds per rifle. The Americans were the exception. They were well supplied with cartridges, but because of the international nature of the relief force, equipped with a variety of different rifles of different calibers, this ammunition could not be shared out. Though they faced an uncertain fate, there was a determination among the men not to be captured. Quote, There was no thought of surrender, recalled U.S. Navy Lieutenant Wurtzborough. The intention was to fight to the last with the bayonet, unquote. By the 23rd of June, Seymour's force was just 6 miles from Tientsin, but nearing the end of its collective tether. But then an opportunity suddenly presented itself. Out on the plain near the river was the large Shigu arsenal, a giant store for imperial weapons and supplies, and the Chinese had foolishly left the place virtually unguarded. Allied troops quickly captured the arsenal and found it packed to the rafters with modern weapons, ammunition, and food. When the Chinese realized their error, they launched a strong attack against the arsenal in an attempt to recapture it, but Seymour's men, resupplied and refreshed, beat them off. However, they remained besieged. James Watts, an extremely brave young British civilian from Tientsin who had accompanied the Seymour expedition, volunteered to ride through the Chinese lines to Dagu to bring word of their plight. Watts set off with an escort of 3 Russian Cossacks and managed to get through to Dagu. A telegram was immediately sent to Tientsin, apprising the garrison of Seymour's location and the dire straits that his expedition was in. On receipt of the message, a relief force of over 2,000 men marched out on the 25th of June and relieved the arsenal the same day. The next morning, the exhausted survivors trekked back into Tientsin. Quote, I shall never forget to my dying day the long stream of dusty, travel-worn soldiers who for a fortnight had been living on quarter rations and fighting every day, recalled a British missionary. The men were met by kind ladies with pails of tea, which the poor fellows drank as they had never drunk before, some bursting into tears, unquote. Admiral Seymour's expedition had been costly and an embarrassing failure. 62 of his men had been killed and 232 wounded, with the survivors sent packing the way they had come by superior Chinese forces. It was a humiliation that the Western powers would not take lying down. In Peking, the 23rd to the 25th of June witnessed the fiercest fighting so far, as Boxers and Imperial troops tried to overwhelm the defences with mass assaults. The desperate defenders shot down their attackers in droves, and eventually the Chinese tired of the slaughter and resorted to different tactics. They began constructing mobile barricades that they used to slowly tighten the perimeter around the Legation Quarter, building more solid defences behind them. On the 23rd of June, the Chinese tried to burn the British out of their legation, but instead they burned down the Hanlin Library, a priceless repository of Chinese literature. Many sinologists amongst the foreign defenders were heartbroken to watch such treasures go up in smoke. Many salvaged what they could from the ruins, and some volumes can today be found in the British Library, the Bodleian in Oxford, and other repositories and collections around the world. The defenders decided to counterattack the Chinese on the 24th of June and push them back. An American bayonet charge west along the top of the Tartar wall pushed the Boxers back half a mile. To the east, the Germans also went in with the bayonet, killing dozens of Boxers in brutal hand-to-hand combat. In the Fu Palace, the defending Japanese and Italians feigned a retreat, leading the Boxers into a trap. The Japanese and Italians suddenly turned about and opened devastating volleys upon their exposed foes. A 7-strong party of Royal Marines led by Captain Lewis Halliday made a sortie from the British legation to try and deal with Boxers attacking the legation's wall. In an alleyway, 5 Boxers armed with rifles confronted them. In the ensuing melee, 1 Marine was fatally wounded, and Halliday himself was shot through the left shoulder and lung at close range. Disregarding his wounds, quote, he responded by shooting 4 of his opponents with his revolver, the 5th escaping round a corner when the weapon misfired, unquote. Halliday led another sortie later that day against a small building that the Boxers were using as a firing point, demolished it, and cleared the line of fire from the legation wall. Captain Halliday was awarded the Victoria Cross for these 2 very gallant actions and spent the remainder of the siege in hospital. On the 29th of June, a last message was received in Tientsin from the legations. Situation desperate. Make haste, it read. The situation in the Legation Quarter was indeed becoming desperate. On the 1st of July, a surprise attack forced the Germans off the vital Tartar wall, and the Americans were taken in the rear and forced to join the German retreat. The U.S. Marine Corps commander, Captain Myers, personally led a counterattack consisting of his own men, supported by Royal Marines and Russian troops. At the same time, the French were forced out of their legation, but they quickly counterattacked and retook their former positions. An Italian sortie into the Fu to try and capture a Chinese artillery gun failed, with some loss of life. At the western end of the Tartar wall, the Chinese were observed busily constructing a wooden tower that, when completed, would allow them to fire down into the American defense zone. Captain Myers once more led an assault force of his own men and some Royal Marines to capture the tower, which they did during the early hours of the 3rd of July. The tower was burned, but Myers was badly wounded and taken to hospital. On the 7th of July, the defenders had a stroke of good fortune when Chinese Christians discovered a buried cannon when they were digging a trench. It dated from the Second Opium War and was cleaned and restored by British and American naval personnel. It was discovered that with some small modifications, the Russians' 9-pounder shells fitted the muzzle loader and could be safely fired. The cannon was mounted on an Italian gun carriage and known variously as Old Betsy, the Dowager Empress, and the International Gun. The gun soon proved its worth when it successfully destroyed a Chinese artillery position close to the perimeter. The Chinese virtually abandoned costly frontal assaults and instead settled into lobbing shells into the Legation Quarter and sniping. They also started underground mining. On the 13th of July, an enormous mine was exploded beneath the French legation. It started a massive fire but killed only 2 sailors. Admiral Seymour, in order to open the road to Peking, planned an assault on the Chinese walled city at Tientsin. He knew that he must relieve the legations as speedily as possible, and after the false start of the previous 2 weeks, time was running out. On the 13th of July, an assault force of 6,900 men was ready. This consisted of 2,500 Russians, 2,000 Japanese, 900 Americans, 800 British, 600 French, and 100 Germans and Austrians. The Chinese defences were formidable, consisting of a curtain wall 20 feet high and 16 feet thick, with massive stone gates on 4 sides. The walls lined with 12,000 riflemen, machine guns, and a few modern artillery pieces. It was probably the most formidable objective that any Western army had faced in China since 1839. The terrain that the Allied army had to cross was also a considerable challenge. Between their start line and the objective was 1 mile of largely open, flat and treeless farmland and swamp, intersected by canals and earthen bunds. The only redeeming features were numerous Chinese burial grounds and the canal banks. Quote, "The country was a flat level one with grave mounds and dikes in great numbers, and these already dug trenches were of very considerable help to us. In such an open, fire-swept plain we would have had difficulty advancing," wrote Colonel Meade. "The fire of the Chinese both in artillery and infantry was fearfully accurate." Unquote. The attackers would be at a major disadvantage. The plan was for the city to be simultaneously stormed on 2 sides. The British, Americans, and Japanese and French would try and smash their way in through the south gate, while the Russians and Germans attacked the east gate. Tientsin civil engineer Herbert Hoover, later President of the United States, guided the force towards their objective. In the early hours of the 13th of July, Hoover and a party of U.S. Marines guided 3 columns of British, American, Japanese, and French troops to the south gate approaches. Firing erupted from the high walls and gatehouse. It was so severe and accurate that the regiments were forced to lie down in the mud. The U.S. 9th Infantry Regiment lost its commanding officer, Colonel Emerson Liscombe, within minutes of arriving. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Welsh Fusiliers, was similarly pinned down. Its soldiers, dressed in khaki Boer War uniforms, white webbing and khaki-covered pith helmets, desperately fired their Lee Metford rifles as bullets whipped past their heads or stitched across the mud all around them. Their officers lay alongside them, grasping their drawn swords and service revolvers. Several 12-pounder naval guns that had been laboriously hauled ashore from HMS Terrible provided fire support. These same guns had been used earlier in the year to relieve Ladysmith in South Africa. The Japanese commander, Major General Yasumasa Fukushima, had previously fought the Chinese in 1898, and he warned the British field commander, Major General Dawood, that if trapped, the Chinese would fight to the death, but if left an escape route, they would retire. The Japanese tried several times to blow in the south gate, but each attempt was shot down with heavy casualties, or the Chinese cut the fuses. The attacks were cancelled. The Americans alone had taken over 140 casualties during the day's fighting. At 3:30 a.m. on the 14th of June, a Japanese volunteer went on a suicide mission to the south gate. Lighting a very short fuse, he was killed in the resulting explosion, but the south gate was successfully blown in. The Japanese charged inside with American and British troops hot on their heels. The Russians now attacked the east gate again and also broke it. This provided the Chinese with an egress, and most of the defenders now fled Tientsin. What followed was a shocking display of barbarity on the part of the Russians and Germans, who started looting houses and raping Chinese women, many of whom were bayoneted to death immediately afterwards. American and British troops tried to intervene, resulting in some fighting between the Allies. The Japanese did nothing. They were at the time shocked by the atrocities and by the behavior of their Western allies. Casualties for the operation had been heavy. The Japanese lost 320 killed and wounded, the Russians and Germans 140. The Americans suffered 25 killed and 98 wounded, the British 17 killed and 87 wounded, and the French 13 killed and 50 wounded. The strength of the Chinese defense and the number of casualties concerned the new overall commander deeply. 54-year-old Major General Sir Alfred Gassely wanted to push on to Peking with a reinforced army, and the Americans supported him. Gassely was a highly experienced soldier with over 30 years of campaigning behind him, mostly in India. A former commanding officer of the 5th Gurkha Rifles, Gassely stepped into the post of Relief Force Commander when the actual appointee, German Field Marshal Count von Waldesee, had not arrived in China in time. The other allies had favoured waiting until they had assembled an army of at least 50,000 men, which would have taken many weeks. Gassely and his American counterpart knew that such a delay would probably mean the deaths of their compatriots in Peking, rendering the entire operation pointless, so they decided to press on with less than half that number. The Peking casualties continued to mount. The commander of the Royal Marines Detachment, Captain B.M. Strauts, was killed, helping to relieve exhausted Japanese troops in the Fu on the 16th of July. The Chinese government's attitude suddenly began to shift with news that General Gassely was preparing to march from Tientsin. MacDonald received conciliatory notes from the Imperial Foreign Ministry and a ceasefire was adopted. News arrived in the Legation Quarter from a Japanese agent that the Allies had taken the walled city of Tientsin and a column was marching to their relief. But the attitude of the Chinese government soon began to harden again when no relief column appeared. Ceasefire violations increased and the behavior of Chinese officialdom became increasingly odd. Quote, the imperial government, for example, having learned of the death of the then Duke of Edinburgh, sent MacDonald its formal note of condolence. Barely had he finished reading this when his bedroom was wrecked by the explosion of a Chinese shell. Unquote. On the 4th of August 1900, Gassely led his new 18,800-man army out from Tientsin towards Peking. The force consisted of 8,000 Japanese, 3,000 British, 4,500 Russians, 2,500 Americans, and 800 French. The Germans had decided not to join in. The following day, the relief ran into determined Chinese resistance at Beicang, only 6 miles from Tientsin, where 8,000 to 12,000 Chinese troops and 26 artillery guns were dug in on both banks of the Hai River. In Peking, some pro-ceasefire officials were beheaded, and full-scale attacks launched once more upon the Legation Quarter. The British force in China was mostly formed from Indian Army units, as it was both quicker and more effective from a health and acclimatization angle to send in native troops, partly led by British officers. The Americans, British and Japanese advanced up the west bank of the High River, while the Russians and French went up the east side. The plan was for the Japanese, with British and American support, to turn the extreme right flank of the Chinese lines, while the Russians and French turned the left flank on the opposite bank. At 3 a.m. on the 5th of August, the Japanese captured the Chinese artillery battery on the extreme right of the line and then pushed around on the flank. A half-hour artillery duel commenced between the Chinese and Japanese, during which a Japanese infantry regiment crept forward and launched a direct assault on the Chinese positions by the river. The Japanese advanced in close order through corn and millet fields under a storm of fire. The Japanese had requested cavalry support from Britain's Bengal Lancers, but this failed to materialize. The Japanese, with their usual disregard for casualties, pushed on anyway and took the Chinese trenches at the point of the bayonet. Flooding halted the joint Franco-Russian advance. The Chinese suddenly started limbering up their guns and towing them off the battlefield. Then their infantry broke contact, retreated, and cut through riverbanks to flood the fields behind them. The Allied force did not pursue and instead bivouacked in the abandoned Chinese positions, waiting for their supply train to come up from Tientsin. The Japanese had lost 60 killed and 140 wounded. The British lost 1 man dead and 25 injured by artillery fire, and the Russians 6 wounded. The Chinese casualties amounted to over 50 dead. The next day, the Allies' advance continued to Yangtsun, 12 miles from Beicang. Here, the 10,000-strong Chinese army had dug in again on the east bank of the High River, incorporating a 30-foot-high railway embankment into their defences. The country consisted of corn and millet fields. The heat was tremendous, with temperatures of 104 degrees Fahrenheit that caused 20% of the Allied troops to fall out of the line with heat exhaustion that in some cases proved fatal. Water was soon exhausted, adding considerably to their suffering. The Allies deployed 5,000 yards from the Chinese positions. From left to right, the Russians, British Indian, and U.S. Army, supported by the U.S. Marines, with the Bengal Lancers anchoring the right flank. The American and Sikh battalions, supported by British and Russian artillery, deployed into dense skirmish lines and advanced. They were subjected to intense, though largely inaccurate, rifle and artillery fire as they approached their first objective, a small village with a bridge beyond. When 150 yards from the objective, the American and Indian troops took cover behind the 30-foot-tall railway embankment and prepared to attack. Following their officers, who went over the top with their swords drawn, the American and Indian troops charged over the embankment and rushed the village. Faced with such a determined bayonet attack, the Chinese defenders broke and fled. At this point, communications broke down, with the British and Russian artillery continuing to fire into the village, resulting in a friendly fire incident. Several Americans were killed and wounded before the guns fell silent. Altogether, the U.S. forces suffered 8 killed and 57 wounded. Indian cavalry scouting hamlets east of the bridge and Yangtsun reported to the American commander, Brigadier General Adner Chaffee, that these locations were strongly held. Chaffee sent in the U.S. 9th and 14th Infantry Regiments to clear them. The heat was appalling, Colonel Daggett of the 14th Infantry remarking that the sun in China had more power to prostrate men than I had witnessed in our southern states or Cuba or the Philippines. Britain's reliance on Indian troops paid off in conditions like these. Fortunately, the Chinese defenders fled. Over the next 7 days, the Allied armies slowly and agonizingly marched towards Peking, following the High River. The weather continued to cause great suffering, particularly among the European and American troops. No shade, not a drop of rain, nor a breath of air, recorded Lieutenant Smedley Butler. The cavalry and artillery kicked up clouds of dust which beat back in our faces. The blistering heat burned our lungs. Nearly half our men fell behind during the day, overcome by the sun. The Battle of Tientsin resulted in 6 British killed in action, 38 wounded, and 1 dead of heatstroke. The Americans lost 24 killed or died from wounds, 2 dead from sunstroke, and 49 wounded, with Russian casualties of 7 killed and 20 wounded. By the time Gasly's army approached the walls of Peking on the 13th of August 1900, hundreds of men had fallen out due to sunstroke and exhaustion, reducing the force to about 10,000 men. The thought uppermost in everyone's mind was whether they were too late, and all they would find would be the butchered bodies of their countrymen. As the army closed to within 5 miles of Peking, the sounds of artillery and machine guns from within the city were clearly heard. People were still evidently resisting. Tune in next time for the final advance and fight for the Legation Quarter. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my video channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.